Schools. I call to order the June 10th, 2019 meeting of the Cincinnati Board of Education. We welcome everyone. Of course, you had lots of choices on what you could have done this evening with your time, and we're very excited that you chose to spend it with us. So we'd like, while you're here, to capture as much of your attention as possible, so please silence your cell phones and your electronic devices. And keep your tray tables stowed at all times. All right, ladies and gentlemen, please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Ms. Wagner, please call the roll.
Mrs. Bates?
Present.
Ms. Bolton?
Present.
Mrs. Bowers?
Present.
Mr. Davis?
Present.
Mr. Messer?
Present.
Mr. Morosky?
Here.
President Jones?
Okay, I need a motion to revise the agenda to add a presentation, which is an update on the findings requested at our last meeting surrounding the topic of tax abatements and examples from across the state of Ohio and beyond. So may I have a motion to add that presentation to our agenda?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Great. Okay, I need a motion to approve the minutes from the regular meeting, May 20th, 2019, special meeting, May 2019, and the special public meeting on May 31st, 2019. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The minutes are approved as presented. Okay. Let's start with Mr. Davis, who will give us an update of the most recent meeting of the Policy Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Policy Committee met Thursday, May 16th. We reviewed board policies 0155, 5751, 5850, 6835, all of which will move for approval today. 0155 we may withdraw. The committee reviewed 5840, 5860, 5880, 5895, all of which we'll be reviewing again at the June 20th policy meeting. Policy meets June 20th at 11 a.m. in the boardroom. We continue to keep the transportation policies on our agenda, waiting for waiting for Director of Transportation, Mr. Johnson, to come back with suggestions. 4 really big things we're working on in policy. The first is the appropriate adjustments to outside entities using CPS facilities. Mr. Hoying reported that our policies are more geared toward rental of short-term use, and our discussion was more centered around long-term use. You will see in the June 19th board meeting under Board Matters a discussion around long-term use. So we didn't think that discussion should be had at the committee level. And then we'll take that back to the policy committee. The second large area that we're discussing in policy is appropriate guidelines regarding assaults on teachers, a very serious subject. Mr. Hoying reported about several incidents on assaults on teachers by students. He also talked about House Bill 318, Ohio Revised Code 331946, which prohibits the emergency removal of pre-kindergarten through third grade students. There were some comments around how we would make safe for our teachers if a situation happened with that age group. I think Mr. Mooney from CFT suggested some type of in-school suspension. There were other suggestions as well as written in the policy minutes. Another large area that we're covering in policy is data analysis of district goals and fair contract employment and business opportunities. Ms. Levins has been very diligent with our committee, and our committee is proposing that she do a diversity status report, certified vendors phase 1 and phase 2 report with the company I'm looking for. Of course, this is underlined on mine, but not Ms. Bates. No, the disparity study was by Mason Tillman Associates. Tillman Associates, and she's going to be asking that the cost for an availability analysis be in the 1920 budget, and we are recommending that as such. And then the final thing that we're covering and continue to cover primarily under Member Bates' leadership is the internal communication and engagement. We feel this is a critical area for our district at this time. We must ensure that we're making good use of our internal communications and that staff, teachers, parents, students all have access to policies of the district so that we can make sure that they're being internalized. I have nothing further.
Thank you, Mr. Davis.
Thank you.
Any questions for Mr. Davis or the committee from any board members?
Mr. Chair, if I might, I did speak with Chairman Davis. Since we don't have a full complement, our president is not here, I've requested would it be possible to delay or have for next time the issue regarding our bylaw changes as they are proposed, just because that usually is a larger discussion, and I think we should all be together when we decide the changing of the bylaws. So I made that request, and he was kind enough to say, please say it publicly, and we'll see what we could do.
And we're comfortable withdrawing policy 0155 to next month.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? Mr. Moreski.
I think Ms. Bolton is referring to policy 0150, not 0155. 0150 is the bylaws, 55 is the committees. So 0150 is the umbrella for the whole bylaw. You were talking about the bylaws, correct?
Yeah, the bylaws.
Yeah, that's 0150. Just
thank you.
Point
You're
of
right.
clarity. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Morowski.
Mr. Morowski's our numbers man.
And the words, man. So, so what I'm hearing is we will hold on 0150 and proceed with the remaining. Is that correct?
Yes, we'll withdraw
Okay.
0150 for next month.
All right. Any last-minute questions or comments? All right. Moving forward, Ms. Bolton, please present the May 16th meeting of the Student Achievement Committee.
Gladly. Thank you very much. Again, we keep moving ahead, as well as making sure we follow up with previous items. Previous items that you've seen again this month regarding the school names made consistent. We did conclude that, and the administration is moving ahead to get that done and be able to report it to the proper authorities, and that's names of schools having to be consistent throughout reportage. Also, we did mention last time that we do need to make some appointments to the Workforce Development Council. Workforce Development Council is exactly what it sounds like, but it is one of the areas of the preschool promise that reports directly to the school board. It reports I think it's monies issues to finance and the professional development to student achievement. And I think that the administration and the board are working on those additional or new rotating appointments. We also had what we thought was going to be the final approval regarding the recommendation of student code of conduct, but we did not see a final representation of it that included all of the things, or the few things that had been asked for at the very end by both the CFT and also board members. And it's in the hands of the administration at this point in time to check on those, I think it was 3 items. We had a final report about the student attendance incentive so that we can outdo Cleveland's ability to get people to come to school. We want to do that even better than they did. We also, as we will see in Finance Committee as well, we await in the June meetings changes to any prescribed changes to the superintendent's evaluation and her goals. She's been a little bit busy this last month, particularly. We also heard a presentation from J. Bradford Bonham, who is very much involved with the Ohio State Extension Group, and what we have found, as Mr. Morawski has mentioned, if we actually did an inventory of all that we're doing, we'd find out that we have probably a number of career access paths in horticulture and landscaping and what else? All kinds of agricultural sorts of things, and ag is the biggest business in the state of Ohio, so that was sent to the administration to pay some attention to that. We heard from the Spencer folks because they, like a number of our schools, both east and west, are experiencing growing pains, particularly as their program evolves. And we talked at some length about the kinds of things that are going to need to be happening on the east side as we continue to grow and expand. We also heard from Justin Leach, the Director of Testing and Assessment, regarding RFPs for identification in a number of areas and what tests to be used, and they went through the proper procedure. We were reassured that in no way will it negatively impact on what we think has been a new and good approach regarding our gifted identification. So we accepted their recommendation. We had a long discussion about advanced placement and as an equity issue, as well as the kinds of things that we need to be doing even in those schools that are well served by the AP program, wanting to review just how well that's going as well. Mr. McDowell presented that we're on schedule regarding administrative evaluations. I brought up a topic that was something that was needed at Aiken High School regarding rooms. Administration has that under consideration, and I know Mr. Morawski brought to the attention of the committee the very sad news that Mercy Health is departing from its responsibilities and regarding school-based health centers at Silverton School, which is one of ours, and the Mount Washington School. And we did make allowances for the Mount Washington folks to come and present their letter of concern at our most recent board meeting. I submit as written and hope for approval.
All right, thank you, Ms. Bolton. Do any members have questions or comments regarding that report? If not, I'll just put one plug as a farm kid who fancies myself a little bit of an urban farmer with some feathered friends and fruits, vegetables, and other things in the yard. I really love the discussion there around the, building some sort of career path in agriculture and kind of maybe that food chain, and I think it fits very nicely with our good food purchasing program, and I think in addition, an organization that is working in that space that would have lots of also job opportunities that could be married in is Kroger, and some of the innovative things that they're doing with zero waste and what do you call it? Organic and locally sourced farming. So I think that could be a really exciting opportunity to pull that all together, because I know some of the great things happening at Gamble and other places that are really doing some great things there. So thank you for your work there. All right, moving on. Ms. Bolton, how about presenting the May 16th, 2019 Finance Committee meeting report?
Thank you very much. A bit of a shorter report, but just as significant and important. We had the update from our government relations folks, Mr. Kearney, and also heard that much of the initial discussion about new funding foundation formula is probably going to be delayed. Talked also about the budget that the governor is putting forward. Heard there, and then I heard again in Columbus this past week, the increase in monies regarding career tech, career ed, very significant. Also, we talked at length about the community reinvestment agreements and wanting to keep our government liaison folks apprised of where we are and how we might best use them and their network regarding understanding and also communicating and envisioning what the abatement piece might be as we move towards a new negotiated settlement. And then based upon our work schedule and our work plan for the committee, we heard a very extensive report from Mr. Johnson of Transportation. It dealt with the additional monies that we will need to close out this past fiscal year, the cost savings and increased efficiencies, as well as how he is moving ahead with additional vendors, and also how he's been, the rules and regulations regarding our parochial and charter clients for transportation. And finally, that they are moving ahead as we phase in our healthy starts or later starts for our high schools. Finally, the treasurer will present her goals and any changes regarding evaluation system for her on June's meeting. We heard a status of the 5-year forecast, and we also heard some specific cuts that have been made in order to get us to the balanced budget that we need to be. And then finally, a renewal discussion was not really needed because we had already determined that in the full board. And there was continued discussion regarding preschool and the need for us to have that combined meeting that we're going to be having, I guess, on Wednesday. And did find out that the preschool board, preschool promise board had decided to at least temporarily move ahead with a 300% of poverty vote, and we've heard that in our finance meeting. Submit as written.
Okay, any questions or comments for the Finance Committee? Mr. Morosky.
Just a comment to supplement the lobbyist report. I'm sure many of you have seen the news today that Representative Beth Liston, who's a practicing physician from Dublin, Ohio, has introduced HB 165, which would finally end Ohio's status as the only state in the union without health education standards. Of course, those of you who pay attention to these meetings know that Cincinnati Public Schools already adopted comprehensive health curriculum a couple months ago, so we're sort of leading the way, but it would be nice to live in a state that caught up to the 21st, 19th century. So Rep. Beth Liston, practicing physician from Dublin, House Bill 165, and I may give an assignment later about some sort of resolution of support, perhaps, on behalf of us. So that's all.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Okay, last but not least, Ms. Bolton, please present the May 16th Strategic Engagement and Planning Committee meeting report.
It was the concluding committee meeting of STEP, which began back, I believe, in August and September, of about 30 community people who had simply volunteered to help begin a discussion and an outline of what our strategic plan for the next 3 years might look like. The superintendent served both as facilitator and scribe, and also, how shall I say it, expert in the room. We had a very good turnout of the regular members, as well as we had some visitors from Accelerate Great School to visit with us during that period of time. And the superintendent shared a status of where we were, and the committee, not surprisingly, had many, many things to add, change, and suggest, and felt very comfortable doing so. And I think that the superintendent was very gratified by their continued interest and their continuing creativity and visioning. And I know Mr. Davis sat behind me and watched these people all have tremendous ideas and ready to go. So it was a really great closing to that chapter where if you wanted to participate, you were just volunteered, and they started with us and they've ended with us.
Thank you, Ms. Bolton. Any questions or comments? I would like to ask, do we have any members of that committee here with us today? There we are. Could you please stand so we can show our appreciation? Usually, we have a good turnout from people on that committee. We see lots of familiar faces, so they are people who have really dedicated and gone above and beyond in their service to the district.
Mr. Chair, I think the superintendent exhausted them.
Yeah, that's
Finally.
Great. That means we're going to have a wonderful,
them.
wonderful strategic plan.
I don't know if that was the plan, but that was the result.
Very good. Okay, well, that concludes our committee reports for this month. Could I get a motion to approve the committee reports as written?
So moved.
And a second?
Second.
All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Very good. Okay, so we have the presentation that we added to the agenda here. It was simply omitted, but definitely talked about at our previous meeting. And so we have Mr. Steve Driehaus, who is a managing partner from the Good Government Group. Sounds like a great name, things that we could all hope for in this world. But the Good Government Group and Steve are helping us to pull through an understanding of what is current state, what's happening across the country, and maybe more specifically here in our own state, in cities that are taking up this topic. What have they learned? What maybe would they do differently? What things can we glean as we work through our process? So thank you for joining us this evening, and we look forward to your presentation.
President and members of the school board, as well as the administration. I spent the better part of last week contacting school districts across the state of Ohio, contacting national organizations as well as state organizations who have done work in the area of tax abatements. It brought me back to my times as a state legislator, when I worked very closely with a lot of these groups relative to tax policy, albeit on tax expenditures, credits, exemptions, deductions against the sales tax and the income tax. This is a very similar scenario, but at the local level, and I led the charge at the state level to address some of the deficiencies we have on tax expenditures and to analyze what we do relative to tax expenditures. So this was relatively common ground, and it was good to reconnect with a lot of those organizations. What you find in the state of Ohio is a whole variety of things. And I was asked to reach out and find out what the different school districts are doing around the state of Ohio. This analysis is an important analysis, and I think what it tells us is the level of abatements that you're seeing, and I'm going to get on to the types of abatements here in a minute, which you've all seen before. But this actually doesn't include TIF abatements, which is a big deal, because TIFs are very significant. But this is from Ohio Policy Matters, and I took from some other sources, especially around Franklin County, and a couple of the others. I want you to look at this in terms of rough numbers. don't believe that these are accurate numbers because these are all self-reported by the school districts. And they're reported differently by each of the school districts, and again, they don't include TIFs. However, what I want you to see is the level of abatements that we're seeing in Cleveland, in Columbus, and in Cincinnati relative to the other school districts. The vast majority of school districts do not have the level of abatements. Granted, we're dealing with larger school districts in the big 3 cities, but there's nowhere close to the level of abatement that we're seeing in Cleveland, Columbus, and Cincinnati. So I want to draw that to your attention. Mr. Chairman, you asked me to look at a couple other states. I did so. There are only 2 states that hold schools harmless relative to tax abatements, and that is Maryland and Florida. They do not allow local governments to pass tax abatements without holding the schools harmless. There are about 5 or 6 other states when it comes to TIFs where the school district is able to veto a TIF agreement if it doesn't hold them harmless. We have limited authority, as does the state of Michigan. So school districts in both Michigan and Ohio have limited power relative to TIFs and also relative to some of the other abatement policies. The abatements that we're talking about are these. And I know you've seen this before, but I think it's important to reiterate, especially for those who don't spend a lot of time looking at taxes and the challenge of tax abatements. The tax abatements we're talking about here, and they're significant. The top 3 are really the ones that we focus on here in Cincinnati: community reinvestment areas, tax increment financing, and enterprise zones. Enterprise zones are used primarily for big projects. If you're trying to attract a big developer and create jobs, an enterprise zone is typically the way to go. Enterprise zones are a little more cumbersome than CRAs, than community reinvestment areas. And community reinvestment areas give a municipality far more flexibility. And they also allow them to delve into residential tax abatements, which is a big deal here in the city of Cincinnati. And it's a big deal for you. Where you see things all over the board are tax increment financing. And tax increment financing, we create districts, especially so consider Avondale, or consider Bond Hill, or Price Hill, or Westwood. You might say, we want to focus on redevelopment in a specific business area. So we're going to draw a line around this business area to create a tax increment finance district. The development of that district and the growth in the increment is what is kept by the district. All right? That stays within the district. None of that money necessarily goes to the schools. And that's something that we've been practicing a lot here in the city of Cincinnati, and something you have to be very aware of relative to the deals that are being made, because we don't see the same level of tax increment financing in other parts of the state, and I'll get to that in a minute. There are a couple exceptions, but not like we see here in Cincinnati. The other thing that's very important to recognize here is the community reinvestment area, the residential portion. Because there's so much flexibility for municipalities relative to the residential portion of the CRA, we apply it very broadly here in the city of Cincinnati. So that if you come in and you build a house, or if you redesign your house or do a development on your house, the incremental growth in terms of the tax liability does not come back to the schools. And that is a big deal, because the schools are the greatest beneficiary of property taxes, as you know. So if we are foregoing the growth, so if I do an addition on my house and my house is worth $200,000, and then the addition is another $100,000, I now have a $300,000 home. Depending upon the tax rate, the amount of tax that will be collected should go up. But in the case of a CRA, it doesn't go up to reflect that additional $100,000 of value. And because it doesn't go up, you remain the same. And the other thing is that as values increase based upon new housing, the school district doesn't collect it. So what we're doing is we're shifting the burden to longtime residents who have not done redevelopment, who have not built new houses, but who are taking a greater share of the burden, especially when you have a fixed revenue levy, okay? So, given that, let me show you some examples from around the state. In Cleveland, Cleveland's an interesting situation because Cleveland City Schools are run by the mayor. The Cleveland City Schools were brought into the municipality some time ago, and so there's a combined effort. So they would be negotiating with themselves. It's a little different. There's no formal agreement like we have here in Cincinnati between the school district and the city. There is no formal agreement, and most abatements stop at the threshold. So if you go back to those thresholds, without an agreement, this is what a city is able to do, you know, without any discussion with the school board. However, a city wants to have as much power as possible relative to dealing with investors, relative to dealing with developers. So it's worth their while to go up to the 100%, you know, on an enterprise zone or 100% on a TIF district. And so they'll do that because it gives them greater leverage, but in doing so, they have to negotiate with the school board. Without the agreement, they don't have to. Cleveland rarely reaches the threshold. They only have two exceptions to that. One was the VA hospital. The other one was the Flats East, which is a big redevelopment along the Flats in Cleveland, if you're familiar with the Flats. All of the TIF districts, with these two exceptions, all of the TIF districts are non-school TIFs. That means the incremental growth in the TIF district, we first hold the schools harmless. All of the revenue that would go to the schools goes to the schools. And so the incremental growth is only that which is not school funding. This is important because we don't do this in Cincinnati. We don't hold the schools harmless on all TIFs. But that's what they do in Cleveland. You can see that the Flats example has two different phases. Obviously, the school district is giving up far more in phase one than they are in phase two. They recoup much of the property tax under phase two of the development. I believe that was because the first phase was to incentivize developers to not only to develop, but to get leases on the businesses to move in. With enterprise zones, they typically have 10 years, 60% abatement. This is standard. The school district receives 50% of the payroll taxes beyond $1 million. So with enterprise zones, I had mentioned earlier, the idea of enterprise zones is to attract business to bring in jobs. Well, if the payroll exceeds $1 million, then the city, the school district, I mean, can collect a portion, 50%, of the earnings tax or income tax beyond the $1 million. So that's the case with the enterprise zone in Cleveland. The CRA, they have a residential with no approval needed, and commercial, no abatements granted by the city. What's important, though, in the residential on the CRA in both Cleveland and Columbus is that it's limited. And I'll get into this a little more in Columbus, but it's limited. In Columbus, they've actually identified the communities where they should allow these types of districts. So it's not blanket authority across the city. They say this area of the city is ready for development. There's no incentive that's needed. So therefore, we're not going to grant a housing incentive for you to move into this part of the city. And what they have identified is certain neighborhoods that do need incentives, and so they limit the ability to do the CRAs, the residential CRAs, to those given communities. And that's important. Again, we've got all TIF agreements in Columbus are non-TIF, or non-school, very similar to Cleveland. The abatement agreements tend to be one-off. So in neither of these cases do they have an overarching agreement like we have here in Cincinnati. These are dealt with case by case. And when I was talking to the folks in Columbus, they said, really, we only have 3 big deals that we've negotiated over the past several years. Because several of the deals, both Easton Mall and Polaris, held schools harmless. There were 2 big deals. The Pizzuti-Rickenbacker deal. Pizzuti is a land developer that came in and developed a whole bunch of property. The current taxes before the development was only $41,000. You can see that they're expecting that to increase exponentially. And then there was an agreement on fixed cash payments, payments in lieu of taxes, to the school district over several years for a total of $1.1 million. The other thing that they do in Columbus, which they take great pride in, is, in addition to the monetary gain that they might see in an agreement, they also insist on very specific school district-centric bells and whistles, if you will. They ask for, in this case, with this deal, reading kiosks, CTE equipment, we have construction trades, internships, and other trinkets and treasures. And so they take great pride in the Columbus School District in negotiating every one of these deals and doing what is best in their minds for the school district and the students of the school district. This was the other big deal in Columbus, very controversial, Cover My Meds. And Cover My Meds is a high-tech healthcare entrepreneur or entity. They were saying they were going to retain 592 jobs and create 1,032 new jobs, bringing them into the community. They were getting the full abatement. They did get the full abatement for property taxes. So that's 100%. The school district only receives a percentage of the income tax. And that's the income tax if the payroll's in excess of $1 million. And that's for the first 10 years. And for the 5 years after that, the school districts get 80% or 50% of the income tax on new employees above $1 million. And the whole deal is not to exceed $20 million. But in this case, it was 100% abatement. So this was all based on income tax. Now, if the jobs don't, materialize, then you never come close to reaching that $20 million. Again, there are trinkets and treasures in this deal. There is a whole host of things that the Columbus City Schools insisted on in terms of how they might benefit the school district. They're very specific on some of these. A lot of them have to do with workforce development. A lot of them have to do with training of students in the trades and other areas. And in this case, also in high tech, because this is a high tech firm. In Toledo, they do have something similar to what we have in that they have a blanket agreement. And the blanket agreement applies to TIF, enterprise zones, and CRA. A deal cannot be less than 67.5% payment in lieu of taxes in order to bypass notification. So that means a school district has to get at least 2/3 of the property tax that it would have otherwise gotten in order to avoid notification. If it's less than that, they have to come to the school district, and it has to be negotiated on an individual basis. Dayton, I couldn't find any individual agreements, but I thought this was worth noting. The MOU between the city and DPS, so they have a memorandum of understanding outlining the city's due diligence. Oftentimes you hear with these abatements that the city's doing everything they can to vet the developers coming in, right? The Department of Economic Development, the city solicitor's office, they're doing everything they can. Well, Dayton has actually outlined this. And they've said, these are the elements of doing everything we can. And we want to know as a board that the city is doing its due diligence when it comes to these tax abatements. I attended the meeting of the Finance Committee at City Hall where I heard the city solicitor say that every single one of the deals in the city of Cincinnati were absolutely necessary for the development to occur. Even the city council members were astonished at that assertion. The idea that they got it right every single time. The fact of the matter is, if you read most studies would tell you that tax abatements are not the reason someone moves into a community. The vast majority of people are looking for educated workforce, good infrastructure, access to markets, access to suppliers, and usually abatement policies come 5th, 6th, 7th. If they can get them, they get them. They're like icing on the cake, right? They're like a cherry on top. Rarely are they the #1 reason for a developer to come in and develop a property in a city. Anyway, I think these are very good to look at in terms of the negotiations with the city, laying down some parameters around what abatements should be, what characteristics should be in an abatement, because again, the schools are the ones being harmed. Anytime there's an abatement, you're paying the greatest cost. So, I had many, many conversations. These are just a few of the examples that I drew out, but I wanted to leave you with some considerations. And this was in many conversations that took place with different organizations. Improve disclosure and transparency. Clarify the due diligence in assessing abatements. Dayton does a good job of this. Incorporate big picture and disclosure process so that the broader community impact can be understood. I think the FC Cincinnati is a good example of this, the FC Cincinnati deal. You know, there are things that go beyond the financial harm of tax abatements. There's housing and displacement and loss of affordable housing. These things have to be considered. And if you want them to be considered, it has to be drawn in to any agreement that you enter into with the city of Cincinnati. Increase accountability, that we have real clawbacks, so in exchange for approval waiver, the district should have some real power to veto decisions on clawbacks or establish a clawback trigger. So, if an abatement goes forward and there's a trigger for clawbacks, but the city doesn't engage the clawbacks, CPS should have some authority to activate the clawback. Because otherwise, you know, what good is the abatement? You're paying for it, but the jobs that they said were going to be created aren't being created and the city's not acting on it. So you have to have power relative to the clawbacks. Strengthen the TIRC process. That's a tax incentive review committee, right? Tax incentive review committee. It's strong in some cities. I know we have a representative on that committee from the school board. The question is how much do they really delve into review of these incentives? And so holding them accountable and really delving into these incentives to make sure that they are doing what they say they're supposed to do is a very important thing. Require greater public disclosures, additional reporting requirements as part of any waiver deal. And then when we get to protecting district rights and benefits, this is really relative to any agreement you might enter into. Require a higher percentage of foregone revenue instead of a fixed sum. The idea that we enter into fixed sum, like we did with the stadia, doesn't make the most sense. What you really should be looking for is a percentage of the revenue foregone and not a fixed sum. The city must hold the district harmless on all abatements in areas that are market ready. So similar to what they did in Columbus, we should identify market ready areas in the city of Cincinnati and we should be held harmless. The school district should be held harmless. Require TIFs to hold CPS harmless non-schools such as Cleveland and Columbus. This is not currently the case in Cincinnati and it's really undermining the revenue that CPS is seeing from the city. Reserve approval on all mega deals, long-term deals, or deals in designated areas, so that if you do have an overarching agreement, there should be a trigger. If the agreement is a certain amount, right, if the tax abatement, you know, exceeds a certain level, then that sets a trigger and we negotiate that. That doesn't fall into the overarching agreement. This is bigger than what we would normally deal with, so we want to negotiate this one as a one-off. Have some type of trigger if you have an overarching deal. Reserve approval on all commercial non-residential abatements, which we should have, but that's in the code. Limit the scope and life of any waiver agreements. 20 years, as you all know, is way too long. A far shorter agreement makes sense. Consider inclusion of trinkets and treasures as they did in Columbus. I thought it was interesting. The treasurer in Columbus takes great pride in negotiating these agreements because they really focus on how an agreement will benefit the school district and benefit the students and the individual schools. It's something to consider. And then finally, bring balance to the notification and negotiation process. Extend district notification rights to include advance notice to teacher and school employee unions as well as parent groups. This should be a transparent process. Ms. Bolton, you mentioned that on several occasions, that you would like to see transparency in the abatement process. Best practices would suggest absolutely, and we should open it up to the community to get the community's input on this as well. If we can do so, we should fight for that. I've listed the resources that I called upon, and that's in your presentation, so you can take a look at that. If there are any questions, I am more than happy to do my best to answer them.
Thank you very much. That was eye-opening in many ways, so thank you for your efforts in pulling that together. So I'll refer to our board for any questions or comments. Ms. Bolton?
Once I start, I know there'll be others as well. Several things. I think this was very helpful, and you did exactly what we asked you to do, which was to report back as to what's going on in other parts of the state and what are the best practices that perhaps we could be investigating and maybe including in our proposal or our opening in resolution regarding what we would expect of the new successor agreement. So I'm very interested in that. And I think that when we get to the assignment time, it probably would be that I would certainly say that the administration could certainly review some of those best practices as we continue to evolve this resolution, because some of that should certainly be, I would think should be included. I have a philosophical question from a standpoint is the concern I have about us telling the city how to conduct their business, because we certainly wouldn't want them to tell us how to conduct our business. So we have to find that happy medium as to where our proposal or our requests or demands or what have you somehow speak to how we conduct ourselves first and what we would expect from the city, but then also what kind of relationship would we have ongoing. I know this board has had a discussion about, do we want to enter into this realm of approval of particular items or particular developments, and we have to have that kind of conversation. But I think just right off, I think this has been helpful. More particularly, I think the administration could review this for the best practices that perhaps could make sense in Cincinnati, and then for us to have a philosophical discussion about how broadly we want to enter into a future that might be more transparent, but also more responsibility for us, which some of us might be ready to assume. So I think this has been great, and I look forward to the further discussion of it. I thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. Bates?
Yes, and we know that Cleveland gets a much higher state share in their foundation formula, like around 75%. We get less than 25? Or more than that, yes. And Columbus is probably, what, in the 40s or 50s. So there's not as great a reliance on local taxes as we have. So this is, I mean, those are, you know, those are pretty impressive numbers for those cities. But to us, it means so much more because we get so much less from the state.
Yeah.
What I didn't include is a state practice, or a best practice, which I certainly would include, is, you know, when I was at that finance hearing, they kept trying to refer to the state funding formula. And I would, in every case, every school district said, take that out of the equation. That is not part of the agreement. You do not know what's going to happen with the school funding formula. We thought it was going to be in the budget this time, not, you know, we've been dealing with DeRolf for decades. We haven't been in compliance in the state of Ohio. And maybe something will happen, maybe it won't. But for the city to make a determination on an abatement based upon what they believe the possible revenue will be relative to the school funding formula is totally inappropriate. And that should be taken off the table in any discussion relative to abatement policies.
Mr. Morosky?
Thank you, Mr. Driehaus. That was great. And piggybacking off kind of that point, that's why I think, and I've said it here a couple times, and I'll start this by saying it again, is that whatever agreement we come to, if we come to an agreement, I think it has to be authentically reevaluated by an auditor, an outside auditor, every year. Because if the number changes, which it does, then the percentage needs to change if that's ultimately the route we go. Also, I'm going to echo Ms. Bolton's concern about just treading responsibly, I guess is the right way to put it, about what we tell the city to do. I have concerns about the resolution we're going to talk about later on in this board meeting regarding our audacity with telling them what to do. I know I don't want them telling us what to do. So I do have concerns with that philosophically and pragmatically, actually. But I have a direct question about the residential abatements. I'm no abatement expert, nor am I a TIF expert, but I think I know enough to be dangerous. The way I understand the residential abatements in this city, largely, not entirely, but largely they're used to encourage eco-friendly LEED builds. And the only way you can get 100% is if you have a platinum LEED certification, which is nearly impossible unless you're a millionaire.
Right.
Outside LEED, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I might be, the CRAs for residential are abated only to $275,000, and then everything above that we would recoup, meaning if someone builds a $2 million house, you would get everything above that. So in the example of a $200,000 to $100,000, would we not receive property taxes on that $25,000? The number isn't zero. We get money on residential abatements. Am I wrong?
I know you're correct when it comes to the LEED abatements. I'm not sure what the threshold is relative to the abatements in the city of Cincinnati. I'm happy to look into that. Maybe somebody at the administration already knows the answer.
Because the residential piece I know has been a sticking point on this board, and it's come up a decent bit, so I've tried to learn more about it. I just want to be careful that we are not discouraging investment in neighborhoods that could really benefit from having a $275,000 threshold, where I, speaking for myself, would be fine with encouraging development in some neighborhoods like that, whereas if someone's building a $2 million house, we're still recouping some taxes on it. So I think that may be a nuance and an intricacy, but I also think it's maybe an important one before we start telling people what they can and can't do.
Mr. Moreski, I understand the board's reticence in telling the city what to do, and I'm sure the mayor and city council would not take it very kindly where was the school board to tell them what to do. However, I do think it's important to remember that you pay the cost. So the decisions being made by city council and the mayor relative to tax abatements, the cost is incurred by students and teachers and the school board. And so I think that's important to keep in mind. You are a significant player here, and that's why these agreements are entered into.
I also think it's important to keep in mind that the city doesn't have to have an agreement with us, and we could get even less money than that $18 million that's already on there. And so where I'm sitting, I need to make decisions that protect the dollars for our students, and if the city decides they don't want to mess with us, period, we'll get less than that. And that's important to remember too.
Well, and that depends on how you negotiate. So in both Cleveland and Columbus, they've decided that they are better off without an overarching agreement, that they'll take it one by one, because the city does want to pursue the larger deals, right? So they do want to get these 100% abatements. If they do that, they do need your approval. And so you do have authority when it comes to those. If they want to stay under the threshold, then you're right. They don't have to come to you for anything. But if they want to go beyond that threshold, they do have to negotiate with you, be it in an overarching deal or if it's a one-off. And so you do have power here relative to the negotiations. And I would suggest that it's very important to look at the percentage that you forego rather than a lump sum. Look at the percentage foregone if you're going to look at any abatement type deals that are overarching, and have triggers in any overarching agreement that would then create greater scrutiny, cause greater scrutiny for the school board.
Very good. Ms. Bolden?
Just as a follow-up, if I might, and we don't want to tell people how to run their business or vice versa, but I do think your point is well taken. We are, and our children are, paying the price. The city does not pay a price for abatements. Then people don't seem to understand that the revenue that they're talking about is supposed to be coming to us.
You and all the other levies that are out there.
Yes, and we are actually on the point for a number of other entities, be it the zoo or elder care, whatever. But my big concern after being on this board so long at this point in time is out in the community, the frustration and anger about abatements is beginning to have a very negative impact on how people feel about property taxes. And that, in the long term, is going to negatively impact on our ability to get renewals, let alone new money. So we not only are losing that revenue, But the reality is, ultimately, in the public mind, somehow we're going to also be victimized by this frustration. So I think it does behoove us not to tell the city what to do or how to behave, but it does behoove us to try to use this opportunity to clean up this chaos of abatements and make sure that we keep our credibility and the city regains its credibility on abatements. And I think that's philosophically, broad picture, we have to do that or we're going to be less financially stable, not just because we're losing revenue, but because people will have lost their trust regarding the property tax itself.
Thank you. So thank you for bringing that to us tonight. I think benchmarking is one of the most underused, important and critically important steps to making sound decisions, especially in my limited experience in this public sector work. And I think what you did was allow us to see what are other people doing, what other tools or creative ways have other cities approach the same topic and developed agreements that many, I think, have been done in relatively recent, in the recent past. So, you know, I think I echo the concern that we don't want the city to feel that, you know, we are in any way trying to do their business. But at the same time, I think it's upon us, to the points that we're taking here, to make sure that we're informed, because I haven't seen the benchmarking take place. I haven't seen us do anything but suggest we just do a search and replace on the year and keep the agreement going forward. I mean, that's basically what was asked of us at that first report, if we all remember that. And I think what we're saying is, pause, let's go big, let's look sideways. What else could we be thinking about? What other issues that are important to the very families and children that we serve, like affordable housing? How could we look at changes based on maybe what some other cities are, where we may not want to do away with residential abatements, but it seems like we're an outlier in that and many other ways, where we have these very widespread and not targeted as perhaps maybe they could be. So, but I also truly believe, and I have deep respect for the majority of people down at City Hall, that they're probably those people that will ultimately be making this decision. I think we have a whole lot more in common than maybe what we think at this point. So one thing that I would request is, you know, I wrote down like 6 or 7 categories, and I can see this in a one-pager. And if I were wanting this information to be able to kind of look across for each of these and then have the cities, and here's what this city does, here's what this city does. And then, you know, with that, then the kind of the executive summary of kind of that lost revenue that you kind of opened up with. But I think that comparator is important, and it really will be sharing information with the stakeholders, because of course our primary responsibility is to our students, but we also have, as kind of Ms. Bolden alluded to, a responsibility to those taxpayers too.
Well, and to that end, Mr. Chairman, I think you should view this as a partnership with the city. I mean, the best thing the city can do to attract jobs to Cincinnati is to have an outstanding public school system. And so the investments in the public school system are critically important. Ask any employer, and what they're looking at is workforce and qualified workforce. That's what they're looking for. The school district is critical to that end. And so we should view this as a partnership and not a competition.
That's right.
What is in your interest is in the interest of the city council.
And we have some great friends there at City Council who support Cincinnati Public Schools. So thank you.
Thank you.
I'm sure there'll be some follow-up following the next 2 presentations. All right. So moving on to our next presentation, this one is Imagination Library, and this will be presented by Tiana Henry.
Good evening. We're really excited to be here tonight to give you an update on a program that is very dear to us. I'm Greg Schumlas, a primary care pediatrician at Children's Hospital, and this is Tiana Henry, our program coordinator. We were last here about a year ago, and just an overview of our program, that our program, which we're now calling Prescription for Reading, is a really unique combination of two well-known literacy promotion programs, Reach Out and Read and the Imagination Library. The Reach Out and Read portion is the part that happens in the medical office. And what Reach Out and Read does is really make literacy promotion part of primary care pediatrics. So when we see a preschool child in the office from 0 to 5 for a checkup, we're able to give them a book, but more importantly, we talk about the importance of reading and kind of model shared reading techniques with the family. But at the same time, we also make sure that they're signed up for the Imagination Library, which is the portion that happens at home. And you may remember that the Imagination Library sends a book directly to the home of enrolled families from birth until age 5, developing a library of up to 60 books at home. So we have repeated touch points with families at their well-child visits, and then lots of books at home. And so
And if you could just speak a little louder, or if I don't know if that mic will move. Perfect, thank you.
So the whole goal of our program is to have parents increase the time they spend at home on reading, really engage them in educational activities and opportunities, and also have children arrive at kindergarten ready to learn and succeed. Now, over time, we started our program in the fall of 2015, and currently we have 10,800 children enrolled in the Imagination Library. Since our children graduate at age 5, we've touched over 15,000 children thus far. We have about 23 clinics throughout the city that do this unique combination of the guidance in the clinic visit and make sure they're signed up for the Imagination Library. And to date, we've sent over 350,000 books into the community. We've been following our families about reading frequency at home, and you can see from the pie chart that our frequent readers increased from 45% to over 58%. But more importantly, the red zone, the families who didn't read at home at highest risk for poor kindergarten readiness, decreased from 11% to about 2%. We also know from our surveys that there's much more enthusiasm and interest in reading at home, and the families have really changed their whole life around their literary activities. Now, another thing that we've been doing is following our participants' kindergarten readiness scores when they get to kindergarten. And last year, we were happy to report that we did see an increase in their performance on the KRA. And this year, again, we're really excited to see that our children entering kindergarten are performing at a 15% better on-track rate in literacy than our kindergartners 3 years ago. Now, to really put this into perspective, we did some comparisons. And so this is a comparison of our 3 kindergarten classes against CPS at large. So you see in the first year of the program, our children were on track on literacy about 15% less than CPS at large. But now we see we've really begun to close that gap, and they're only about 3% less on track than CPS at large. We also did a comparison, We also did a comparison to a similar socioeconomic class. This is basically by neighborhood, so this is in comparison to their neighbors. So again, you see in the first year of our kindergartners, they were about 7% below on track in literacy, and now actually they're performing about 7% above their neighborhood children on the on-track rate in literacy on the KRA. We also kind of did a comparison to look at frequency of reading at home with their performance on the KRA, and the less frequent readers are on the left and more frequent on the right, and again you see a definite increase in the pass rate on the KRA with more reading at home. Now these are all the numbers, but we also are making a lot of other impacts at home with our families.
So, the Imagination Library program has so much impact. Remember the last time we talked, the first book that the children get in home is The Little Engine That Could, the classic. The last book that they get, and this is on their 5th birthday month, so the month when they turn 5, they get the book, Look Out Kindergarten, Here I Come. Imagination Library ensures children have high-quality, age-appropriate books in the home. It increases in home literacy, practices in parent engagement, and parents play a very important role in early literacy. As we tell our parents, you are your child's first teacher. It increases enthusiasm about books and reading. So this program is more than just sending books in a home. We're actually impacting the families. We have a special guest here today. We want to hear from a family that we hold close to us. We have one of the parents that come to the clinic, and this is where she got her first book from Dr. Zumlas after seeing her through a well child check. We have parent Latia Kemp and her daughter Amari Sloan, who is now, well, she just finished kindergarten at Parker Woods Montessori.
Hello, I'm Latia Kemp. I've been in the program for about 4 years. My daughter, Amari, she's a little shy. She's been in the program since she was about 2. And like Ms. Tiana said, she just completed Parker Woods Montessori. She'll be headed to 1st grade, and she just completed the program. One of her favorite books is the book about the Gruffalo and the mouse. The mouse uses the Gruffalo to scare away its predators in the forest, and she really likes the story and the plots of that book. I have a son as well. He's 2. He's also in the program. He loves books. He's on the autism spectrum, but even though he doesn't really know how to read, he really enjoys looking at the pictures and the colors of the books. When Amari first started kindergarten, she didn't really do as well in reading, but over the course of the year, while she was in kindergarten, I did notice that her literacy improved greatly. I started reading to her a lot more. I read to her and her brother at least 3 to 4 times a week. Most of the time, her brother will give me a book, or she'll give me a book before bed or in the morning. And my daughter, she has lots of energy, so to calm her down, I have to read her book, somewhat what she's doing now. But she's been doing a really good job. This is a very good program, and I hope it continues to excel in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Amari.
Yeah. So parents everywhere are very excited about Imagination Library. We have parents come and rave about the program. They get books at home, they get books at well child checkups. How many books can you have? This is a wonderful program, and we are just very excited to show you results. And not only results from the numbers, but also results from a parent. So, anything else? This is just some more parents talking about how much they love the program. And before we end, we just want to say thank you so much for your time. This has been a wonderful endeavor we've taken up, and we're seeing results in the community, and children and parents are reading. You have any questions?
Thank you so much. All right, do members have any questions or comments? Ms. Bowers.
I am very excited about this program. Being a former Every Child Succeeds assessment worker, I do know about the importance of books in the home and counting them and making sure the parents that the literature is available for children. One question I do have is there any data connecting progress in reading in school with being in this program early, like success or connecting, I guess, really how the child is progressing with understanding what they're reading and things like that?
So far, since we've only been around 3 years, so our first 3 classes have just gotten to kindergarten, so we do just know that we are improving their performance on the KRA. We plan to continue to follow them further along so we can see effects on 3rd grade reading and beyond that.
So there is a longitudinal aspect to it?
Yes.
Okay.
Ms. Bolton?
So, thank you so much, and the data was very useful, but seeing her is most important, so I appreciate it. Just a quick question. I was interested particularly where you said that the children were compared to their peers within their neighborhood. Could you explain that one just a little bit more? Because I'm interested as to were the peers in their neighborhood also patients at the health centers, or tell me a little bit more about them, because I felt that was pretty intriguing.
Yeah, so we don't have any direct financial data on patients or through the KRA scores that we get. So this is based on geographic location. It was done to identify people living in a similar socioeconomic status. And so the comparison group are children who live in the same zip codes as the Imagination Library participants. Now, the comparison group can contain people that are in the Imagination Library that we just couldn't match, because the match is a really hard thing to do. But the comparison group is all the children that live in the same neighborhoods. We're doing some more refined kind of matching where we're going to look and do a one-on-one match. Right now, the comparison group is a lot larger than the Imagination Library participants, but we're still working on the data to do a more close match to be able to look at that a little bit more in depth.
I think that would be useful because I think that's an important point or benchmark or whatever, comparing the neighborhood and the children that are participating and then not participating. But that also is a reason, is it the program or is it other aspects of that family is not participating in a number of things or something. So I think more data there would be very interesting and I think very telling as we focus more and more on the social determinants, if you will, on education. So thank you.
Mr. Morosky.
Thank you all so much. This has been a great presentation. I'm a huge fan of the program, and I'm especially interested and excited by the data regarding the amount of time that parents are spending with their kids. That otherwise may not have occurred, or if it was occurring, maybe not with as much frequency. We know in our world, educationally speaking, and in my world at Children's Hospital, that the more sort of lap time or parent time that a kid has, all of their metrics in school tend to go better. So my question is really for us, more than anything, is how do we continue to keep this going? Because the way I understand it, this goes for how much longer until the bill needs to be footed by another entity?
At the end of this calendar year.
So that's probably not a question for you then. I mean, are we able to continue to the program and send books to the kiddos in the district?
So we've had this conversation many times, and the dollars that we receive within the district cannot be used for children who are not school-age children. So the youngsters begin receiving the books at what age? As soon as
birth, yes.
As soon as birth, okay. So quite honestly, at that point in time, we have absolutely no idea where those kids will end up in terms of a school district. But in addition to that, we cannot use our general fund dollars to pay for students who are not a part of our district. It is not proper
Public purpose.
Thank you. All the P's, yes. And so we cannot simply fund this within CPS.
So I might give an assignment later regarding what proper public purpose is, because the way I understand proper public purpose, this could be potentially considered that, considering 7 out of 10 kids will end up in our schools, and if nothing else, if we're sending out books. I talked to Board Member Messer long time ago, actually, about this program, and could, if nothing else, be used as a marketing tool. There's a CPS flyer in your book. So I, for one, am interested in trying to figure out a way to move it forward, as long as we're not breaking the law, of course. So, Mr. Hoying, pay attention, make sure I'm not suggesting we break the law, but I don't know if board colleagues have an opinion on this. The way I understand proper public purpose, I think this could fall under it, but again, I'm not the arbiter of that. But
I would also just like to say a lot more research into the data would have to be done to prove that, quite honestly, we were agreeing to fund something that we could say conclusively this led to the results. As it was stated, there are a lot of other factors that could be involved that lead to those results. And so, quite honestly, unless you're doing an isolated study, then I think it's hard to say that this specific thing led to academic or literacy improvement. So again, we would be treading very carefully as we move forward.
Thank you, and I'll just close out by saying, if I weren't here, I would be reading books to my children, and these days I draw a crowd. We're getting a little group around, and you know, I know that I do that because it's what you're supposed to do, and it's because I've seen so much data over the years that talks about readiness. And if you're a parent that is working 3 jobs to take care of your children and trying to do 10 or 15 other things at the same time, stopping to buy a book, let alone then finding time to read, is going to be challenging, the way, you know, so many of our families operate today. And I think anything that we can do to inspire children to read by being read to, and then ultimately to read, you know, this data is very compelling to me, and I think that, you know, of course we'd want to dig into that, but I think just imagining those books going into the hands of the children and the little engine that could, that was last night's story, very specifically in our house. This is real, and I think, as Mr. Morosky talked about, this is our demographic of tomorrow. And so if there's a way to ensure that our children can not just have access to books and begin that passion for learning and specifically reading, but if we could also then begin to open their eyes to this program about all the offerings that we have at Cincinnati Public Schools, woven into that experience. As a marketer, I don't know that we do as much customer cultivation until it's time for them to buy. And that's when they go sign off. And I think if you look at my day work, the customer experience starts 6 months before we engage in a conversation with them, opening the apertures for them to even be willing to listen to what we're selling. So I look forward to a broader conversation, and thank you both for coming in. And very specifically, Ms. Amari, congratulations on your success, and we wish you all the best in the year ahead. So thank you all. Have a great night. Okay, Ms. Bates.
Yes.
Looks like you're up next.
I am up. Well, actually, I'm going to delegate. But as you know, you share me with other boards. And one of them is Go Vibrant. And kind of in a nutshell, this is an organization that is a citywide effort to promote fitness and have fun while you're doing it. I want to introduce you to the founder and president, well, actually CEO of Go Vibrant, Mark Jeffries. He's also a CPS parent. He has a daughter in the audience, and we met his other daughter last month. She was the salutatorian of Clark. So, good. Yes. That's good. Awesome. And so Mark has some really good news to share with the board. He presented at our board meeting last month, I think it was about 6 weeks ago, and I'm like, you have to come to Cincinnati Public and tell our board what we're doing. It's so cool. So, Mark.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, so we have 4 kids in Cincinnati Public. So 2 are Clark, 1 just graduated from Clark, and then 2 at Walnut. So thank you for all that you guys do. So we're obviously big fans. So as Melanie said, I founded Go Vibrant about 7, 8 years ago. We're about making activity irresistible. And so what I want to do today is talk about one initiative that we have in partnership with CPS, Laura's team, Josh Harden in particular, to bring athletics to elementary schools. So this is kind of forward-looking. It's always hard to follow a kindergartner, but hopefully this will be engaging and fun. So what I want to do is just first give a little background on what Go Vibrant is. Well, why are we doing this and why are we partnering with CPS? Which hopefully puts it in context, and tell you about this event that we're doing in conjunction with Blink coming up in October called Bounce, which we think will be a lot of fun. So just a little background on Go Vibrant. So it all starts with this. When you think about when you were a kid, the insight of this nonprofit is physical activity is irresistible when it feels like play. All of us, when we become adults, somehow lose that joy of activity, but we all remember when we were kids running and skipping and jumping and everything, and it just felt like play. So we're about restoring that and transforming events and activities to make them play-like. And what does that mean? Creating this opportunity to rediscover that joy of activity. So that's kind of philosophically just what we're about. So what does that mean? I'm not going to go through who's on our board here, Melanie, but you see a lot of names of people in the community who you probably are very well familiar with, just a cross-section of a lot of folks in the community, where we want to make activity a want to rather than I have to. And you're probably familiar, this is the last background, and we'll get into it, with some of the key initiatives that we've had. So the Go Vibrant Scape at Smale River from Park, if you recall, that was a concrete slab. We got P&G donated $1 million to create the foot piano and all of that, which is kind of the epitome of irresistible activity. But then walking, we do a lot with walking, and we did some initiatives last year with some CPS programs getting people walking. Why? Because it doesn't require there's no barrier. You know, anyone can walk. There's no training. There's no special equipment or anything. So that's a core of the walking signs. You see them throughout our community. So we're in 18 different communities and done a lot of work in Avondale in particular, and what we call our Million Step Challenge. So getting people walking. So that's the background on the initiative. Let me just talk a little bit about what this Bounce idea is, right? So first of all, it's funded by P&G. And Kroger in partnership with CPS and the parks with one objective, which is to bring athletics to 16 elementary schools. And so we want to double participation in athletics in elementary schools. So the setup for this is, well, why is it, and these are the schools that are impacted. These are not picked by us. This is by Josh Harden and his team at CPS. So a wide variety of schools where they say, hey, this is where the need is the most to bring athletics, meaning soccer, track, and cross-country in particular. So we're about raising money to do that, mostly through P&G and Kroger, but a mechanism that I'll share here in a second. So why is this needed? We all know the statistics, so I'm not going to bemoan this, but it is really remarkable. 18% of children, 10 to 17 are obese in Ohio, 6th in the country. That's Ohio, obviously. The statistics on, of overweight. Athletic programs in general, this is not a CPS number, but highly underfunded, and especially at the elementary level. Athletics, and talking to Josh and a lot of the athletic directors at different schools, in fact, Clark, who recently talked to him, said, yes, we have to bring athletics to elementary. It really starts in 7th grade, and frankly, a lot of parents move out of the district, or they send their kids up to Mason, for if they can afford it, but a lot of parents can't afford that, right? So their kids don't have the opportunity to be in elementary school athletics. Those who can't afford it send their kids to Mason and eventually, maybe matriculate there because, it's just easier. So this is also a retention issue for CPS, I believe. So the more people who have the opportunity to be engaged at that level is a positive. So just the logistics, let me tell you what it is and then kind of how it works. So this will be over Blink. So as you guys know, Blink is coming in October. They expect 2 million people this year. It's going to go across the Roebling Bridge. In conjunction with that, Kroger is also doing this Wellness Your Way Festival at the Duke Energy Center. So I'll talk about what the CPS, how CPS will be involved in that. And so we're going to activate right on the Smale Riverfront Park, and I'll show exactly what that is here in a second. So leading up to it, the basic idea is buy a ball, get a kid moving. So the math behind this is very simple, which is this. So we will be selling literally balls at Kroger Wellness Your Way Festival, at different events. And those balls literally are $5 a ball, very simple math, gets one kid in athletics for 1 week. So if you're walking into a Kroger, you say, oh, well, wow, I'll buy a ball. $5 for one ball gets one kid in athletics for 1 week. So that has an impact, right, as an individual engaging people. And, so we'll be raffling off Kroger gift cards and everything, but all those proceeds are going towards funding these programs in 16 schools, right? So it's really engaging the broader community as well. And so then we're going to do the event itself, a couple of things. So, we're going to bring CPS children down there to Smale Riverfront Park, to the Wellness Your Way Festival, school competitions, just fun events, tricycle races and bouncy balls and, just fun activities. Again, irresistible, kind of carnival-like material. And then, of course, in the evening with Bounce, with Blink, being there, lighting up, this whole activity, to make it even more engaging, basically driving awareness for what we're trying to do. So the last thing here is just how is this going to involve CPS? Really, obviously, the first is funding for these programs. So, and we've raised enough already from P&G and Kroger to enable significant funding for these schools. But obviously, we'll be selling these balls to enable it even more through activities beyond the classroom. So it'll go through activities beyond the classroom, just to be super clear. But then we're also going to bring a number of different schools through resources directors down to the Wellness Your Way Festival at the Duke Energy Center, as well as the Smale Riverfront Park for a lot of these activities, just to get them active. And then we're offering to teachers and students the opportunities, think about it like a la Girl Scouts, at Kroger, the opportunity to volunteer to sell these as well. Kids help sell stuff in a good way. So our objective is very simple. At the end of this, if we can, as a first year, say, hey, we've been able, in partnership with you, to bring athletics to 16 elementary schools, and then next year, hey, how can we take this further? That gets several hundred kids active that weren't before. So that's all I had. Thank you for the opportunity. Open to any questions, but excited for the partnership.
Thank you very much. Very exciting. Board members, any questions or comments? I think it's exciting, those 13 schools, to think about adding those sports opportunities earlier, to make them competitive later, to get them more active sooner. I think it's all great news. So one question I have is, so this could be a big fundraiser with the number of people that participate in Blink and that type of thing.
Correct.
Is the idea that those dollars then will fund this for X number of years? Or what's kind of the plan beyond Blink?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So we want 16 schools minimum. Obviously, we'd like to do this every year, a la like the Rubber Duck Regatta, that Kroger does, that every year as a mechanism to help fund this. If we go well beyond the 16, then we would work with, Laura and her team. Like, okay, do we want to fund more schools this year, or fund this portion for next year or beyond? So that would be a good problem to have, right? So if we can, get the 16 for sure, anything beyond would be fantastic.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, let's switch to kudos. Does anybody have kudos to share this evening? Anyone? Yes?
I have a kudos for Aiken High School Band. They performed very well in the West Collegio Memorial Day Parade.
Wow, very good. Any others? Okay. Ms. Bates, please present any retirements that you have.
Yes, we have several retirements from our certificated personnel. Rosalind K. Bullard, Irma J. Knott, Vivian R. Rushi, and Sharon J. Schneiders, all teachers. And we thank these professionals for their service to our children and wish them well and congratulate them in their retirement.
Thank you to all of them for their service. Okay, we are now moving on to the topic, hearing the public. And so we will start with our first speaker, Ms. Jacqueline Ennis. And then on deck, we will have the group, Mark Simon, Trinity Brookfield, Anthony Johnson, and Ms. Marlena Brookfield.
Hello, everyone.
Good evening.
Superintendent and the board. First, let me say good evening, and I want to say that I appreciate you allowing me to come and speak. It is a privilege. I do not take it lightly, and I just want you guys to know that. Thank you very much. I just want to quickly discuss or just present a petition here, and the petition is basically the petition's goal is to have this available to every student, parent, caregiver, and guardian of Cincinnati Public Schools. And it is called the Licensure Code of Professional Conduct for Ohio Educators. It was adopted on March 11, 2018 by the State Board of Education. I also would like to present and make it known that the petition can be Googled at #KnowTheirCode, @KnowTheirCode, and that is hashtag and at KNOWTHEIRCODE. That's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And it truly is our pleasure, actually, when we have people like you who care enough to come and speak here at our board meeting. So thank you for coming. And then Ms. Murphy, if you could connect with her, and we'll make sure that you have then a touch base directly with our administration.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.
Okay, so we will then go ahead and bring up Mark, Trinity, Anthony, and Marlena, or the person filling in.
I was going to print out more of these for you all, but it's really expensive to print in color.
We can.
Hold on, Mark, you got two?
No, he's saving trees. I'm with you.
I've got the PDF. Y'all can have it all you want. But basically, I got curious not too long ago about why...
Could you speak just a little closer to the mic?
I got curious a little bit ago about why certain folks in my community get to pay less taxes than everyone else, including myself. I happen to know and work in the same building as Mr. Dusty Rhodes, and after talking to him, I got the list of all the abated properties in the city of Cincinnati and the Cincinnati Public School District, and I thought you all might benefit from seeing it broken down beyond just the big raw numbers, because there are ways that these abatements are used in which certain types of developments are subsidized more than others, and as you all know, CPS is the one who loses the most revenue. But in tax year 2018, I found that CPS lost out on, would have gotten $27.7 million more than it actually received had it been held harmless, according to what you would have received had the abated properties paid on the full market value. And what we found is that obviously the larger the project, the larger the abatement, because there's no upward limit. So offices and apartment buildings pay quite a bit, offices and apartment buildings forego paying quite a bit of taxes, not just to CPS, but to all the other levies. And there are quite a few huge projects of buildings that we all know in the city where over the life of the abatement, they get to forego paying tens of millions of dollars on this one building to CPS alone. The Scripps Center, for example, which the abatement expires next year, so y'all are going to get a big boost from that one, resulted in the loss of $860,000 last year to CPS. And that includes the pilot payment. Without the pilot payment, it would have paid $55,000. Yeah, because 97% of its value was abated. This is a big building. Every $1 million in abatement we found costs CPS $22,000 a year without the pilot. With the pilot, each $1 million of abated value costs CPS $13,500. The larger the project, the larger the subsidy. The 10 largest office developments in the city of Cincinnati account for $5.5 million of lost revenue to CPS alone in 1 year. These include buildings like the Scripps Center, like GE, like 8451, like office buildings in Oakley and in Uptown. Many of these office buildings receive an annual subsidy of over $500,000 a year.
Good evening, board members. The 10 apartment developments with the largest CPS tax losses account for $3,547,295 in losses alone. That is equal to almost 13% of the million. I'm sorry, I read that wrong. That is equal to almost 13% of the total 2018 CPS tax loss from all abated properties, and 56% of the total losses from all abated apartment developments. Cincinnati's newest market rate apartments typically receive between $100K and $500K per year in abatement subsidies. This includes buildings such as the Radius at the Banks, the Virgin CUF, the Boulevard at Oakley Station, VP3 and VP4 in Corryville, the Gantry and Northside, and many others. Again, because abatement tax subsidies are proportional to the size of the abatement, larger apartment buildings will receive larger subsidies. Singles, family, and condominium users represent the vast majority of the number of abated properties, as well as the third and fourth largest sources of CPS tax losses of all land uses. 4,299 out of over 4,800 abated parcels are single-family and condo developments. 86% of these abatements are for properties worth under $500K. And the sum of these abatement values are substantially larger than those for more valuable properties. However, the average abatement given is over double for properties worth over $1 million than those worth less than $500,000. Most single-family abatements are on properties worth less than $250K, with subsidies ranging from a few hundred to a few $1,000s per year. These abatements are typically on rehabbed properties or on additions and renovations to existing homes. Hotels and parking garages have the largest per property subsidy rate on CPS taxes of all the land uses, due to the size of these developments and the low amount of abated hotel and parking garage properties. Abated commercial uses typically include establishments like restaurants, bars, retail locations, and supermarkets. As of the end of 2018, only one supermarket is abated. It is the Kroger Marketplace in the Oakley Station Shopping Center. The 10 most abated neighborhoods account for 76% of the total abatement value. These neighborhoods are downtown Cincinnati, which I guess is one whole neighborhood, Oakley, Corryville, Over the Rhine, Hyde Park, Madisonville.
Hi. Madisonville, Cuff, Northside, Columbia, Tusculum, Mount Lookout. It's a $1.49 billion in abated value. The 10 least abated neighborhoods account for 0.16% of the total abatement value. These neighborhoods are English Woods, Millvale, Lower Price Hill, Sedamsville, Hartwell, East Westwood, North Fairmount, South Cumminsville, Queensgate, and Sailor Park. It accounts for $3.2 million in abated value. Downtown, Over the Rhine, and Pendleton account for 38.1% of total abatement value. CPS lost nearly $22.8 million in property tax revenue from abated properties, including pilot payments and stadium payments. As owners of abated properties do not pay tax on the abated value of their property, CPS is out $27.8 million in 2018 alone that would have been paid on the full market value of the properties. This includes the 27% pilot payments from non-residential properties and residential properties worth over $330,000. The City of Cincinnati pays an additional $5 million per year to CPS to offset the loss of property tax revenue from Great American Ballpark and Paul Brown Stadium, bringing the net loss down to $22.8 million. The average abated property in Cincinnati cost CPS $7,502 in foregone tax revenue in 2018. Downtown has the highest loss per abated parcel at an average of $153,173 in foregone tax revenue. Lower Price Hill has the lowest loss per abated parcel at an average of $30 in foregone tax revenue. And that's all she wrote.
Thank you so much. Mr. Hoyne, oh, actually, we'll get the board staff. If they could grab your information, I think it'd be great to get copies of this to share with our abatement team. I applaud you for the professionalism, and you know, I can't speak to the credibility of the data, but it looks beautiful and fascinating how you've broken it out, so thank you for that. Okay, moving on. So we are now at board matters. Yes, so I lost my place on my agenda here. So the board matters spot is CPS, CPP, meeting preparation, and I know there were a couple of people who asked to have this placed on our board matters topic list. So why don't we begin that conversation? As we all know, we will be meeting with our partners at Cincinnati Preschool Promise on Wednesday evening, an opportunity for us to get both bodies together for the first time in a long time, and really ensure that we're doing everything we can in our quest to ensure as many children in Cincinnati have access to preschool. So let's go ahead and begin that conversation. Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Cincinnati Preschool Promise is a big week. Today we're talking about Preschool Promise's big meeting with CPS on Wednesday. Tomorrow, Sally is going to visit Cincinnati Promise Forward. Then on Wednesday, CPS and CPP meets, and then on Thursday, CPP has its board meeting. Big week for Cincinnati Preschool Promise. There were several things that I wanted this body to talk about, but in conversation with Chair Jones, she suggested that we talk about what we're going to try to be getting out of Wednesday's meeting with Preschool Promise. One of my concerns is around the Preschool Promise's governance structure versus the CPS resolutions for a shared vision and goals government structure. So at CPP, there's a 15-member board, and then there is a 6-member, if I'm not mistaken, a 6-member executive committee. And I've asked Father Graham this question, and I would encourage this question to be asked on Wednesday when you all meet with CPP. There's a consideration or concern that this executive committee goes into executive session without the other 9 board members, which would be problematic in regards to the structure that CPS agreed to in its resolution. There's also a question in regard to how the process around opening the master agreement. If there was going to be an opening of the master agreement, how does that happen? And I saw on the agenda that Mr. Hoying will be talking Wednesday about the master agreement, so I don't have a right now question for that, because I think I can get the update from Mr. Hoying's presentation on Wednesday. But when I addressed this to Phyllis around the board matters, I didn't see the agenda for Wednesday. I just saw that in our packet on Friday. So those are the things that I thought were necessary for discussion before you headed into Wednesday. I'm not going to be there, so I wanted to be clear to bring that up before you headed into Wednesday, and to ask the question, what are you trying to get at? What are we trying to get out of Wednesday to help the preschool promise move forward? I think it's critical that we take the preschool promise very seriously right now and ensure that, first I want to say preschool promise did a great job, and I don't know how they talk Sally into doing an interim, but I'm glad they did, so let's start there. But in this interim time, before they get their new leader, I think it's critical that Cincinnati Public Schools and Cincinnati Preschool Promise becomes much closer in their relationship. And of course, I'd be remiss without saying that I've been saying my whole year and month since I joined this board that the 5 representatives that you sent to serve the Preschool Promise must be more directed or connected to this body so that they are doing the bidding of the Cincinnati Public Schools at the Cincinnati Preschool Promise. I think that's critical if you're going to ensure, and I don't even know, at that time I wasn't on the school board, so I don't even know what process we use to make our appointees, but I know one of them is coming up pretty soon, so we'll have to be going through that again. And that may be a subject for conversation I didn't see on the agenda for Wednesday that you might want to bring up as well.
Sorry, thank you. Any other thoughts on that topic as we go into the meeting on Wednesday? Ms. Bolton?
Yes, I do think that, I think staff provided us with an organizational chart of the preschool promise structure. I think it would be useful if administration would also present to us either before that meeting or at that meeting the actual overview of the whole preschool promise structure, because this is how preschool promise conducts itself and is organized. But the overall picture of the original organizational chart had also CPS's role and what have you, as well as the Workforce Development Council reporting to the board and a few other things. I think that would be useful to help visually explain what the relationship at least was initially envisioned to be. And I do think that it would be good for the 5 representatives of CPS to perhaps take guidance from CPS as to how they might represent CPS. I'm not sure that they're not getting the guidance, but they might not be following the guidance. And that's could be a philosophical issue as to, do we appoint people, or do we have other organizations or stakeholders give us those 5 nominees to represent CPS, or are they representing their own views or what have you? And case in point was the recent vote regarding the 300% of poverty vote that took place, because apparently at least a couple of our CPS representatives voted in favor of that after this board has had discussion about it, and after it had been before finance on 2 different occasions, that we were, we'd even started to outline, I think, the market piece as to how we can better serve the children and families that need the most service, instead of spending that additional money on reaching out to more families. So I think Mr. Davis is totally right about, we need to figure out what that philosophy of representation is, as well as have some sort of ongoing liaison. And I do think that a overall organizational chart, and I appreciate that we will have Mr. Hoyne present the master agreement. I do remember that within 3 months of the creation of the master agreement, there were calls to reopen it. And I know that there was great resistance to that, and I think rightfully so, from a standpoint that you do not create a master agreement that took 11 or 12 different drafts, had to be approved by multiple groups, and in keeping with the original vision, to then immediately open it up. But after 2 years of governance, or after 2 years of effort, there might be parts that would make sense to do so. And particularly, I hope that we are addressing what some people believe to have been the promise of the $15 an hour, and also some of the parameters we put on subsidized tuition and parameters on quality grants. I hope this is not going to be a dog and pony show. I hope it's to have some meaningful discussion, because we are approaching very close now, as this other presentation indicates, a levy where we would have to be deciding whether or not to ask for a renewal of preschool promise, because that is not a given. And we will have to be able to talk about what that might mean.
Mr. Morosky.
Thank you, Vice President and Acting President Messer. I'm really excited for the meeting on Wednesday, and actually I believe it's the very first time both of these bodies have ever met together. I'm looking at board members who have been here for a minute, which is, I think, a shame, and hopefully this will be the start of a new trend where we're all doing this. Just a couple things. I'll reiterate what Ms. Bolton said. I too hope that this is a substantive meeting. The promise, as it was made to taxpayers, it's only going to be fulfilled if we all work together. There are a couple things that have come up just in the past couple of comments. Mr. Davis referring to executive session. I wasn't aware of any of that, but if there is executive session going on, I mean, that's obviously they're right, but that would be everybody except the executive director. I serve on nonprofit boards, and I know what executive session means. So if that's true, it's problematic. And then another thing that I wasn't planning on talking to, but has just come up again from Ms. Bolton, whether or not I personally would be supportive of raising the threshold. I know the will of this board was that it was not to do that, and I'm a team player. And if that did happen, to Mr. Davis's point, that we need to be much more closely tethered to our 5 appointees. If that did happen, again, whether or not I think it should or could be 300%, that was not the will of the body. And if that did happen, that's a significant problem. So that's on us, I think, and Mr. Davis has been very eloquent and adamant and clear about that in his year and a month. And so I'm interested, and that's more our work probably than for the meeting on Wednesday. But I am interested in seeing how we can all work together to fulfill this promise to the taxpayers, because it can't be fulfilled without us working in tandem. And that's kind of, just put it out there, it's kind of the mindset I'm taking into the meeting on Wednesday, is that we need to be good partners with each other, and we need to know what each other is doing. We have public meetings that are streamed, and I think by and large people know what we're doing. And so I would hope and expect the same from the CPP board. And I think it'll be a great start to a revised relationship.
Thank you. Ms. Bates.
Yes, and I also, and I believe I saw it on the agenda, we need to talk about the levy renewal that will include this preschool promise money. That is so critical, and we have to get our, be very transparent and get our processes in place now. One that I've been bringing up in our meetings that I want to make sure I voice in the meeting on Wednesday is if community providers are receiving workforce development funds, that they commit to accept at least some threshold of students that are on subsidies, because that's what that money is for. And that was not, you have an agreement and you put it in place. It's like a policy or legislation. Then, then you say, wow, that was unintended. Well, an unintended consequence can be that somebody can take the workforce development funds and then not serve subsidized students, and there's nothing that addresses that in our agreement. So I think that that's essential, and if the community thought that that was going on, we're not just going to lose the $15 million, our renewal's going to go down. So we have to be really, really careful about how we execute these funds, and we monitor our people, and we communicate with each other.
Thank you. Mr. Davis.
Well, Mr. Morowski made a good point that just shocked my brain. There is not supposed to be a reason for this body to meet with that body. That is why this body had representatives that are on that body. I also want to warn us to not believe that you are equal to that body. You are not. Preschool Promise is run by levy dollars. You are responsible. At the end of the day, and I think Ms. Wagner mentions every once in a while that her license is on the line, nobody else's. So we are not, it's not like this is two equal bodies getting together to chat about, no, this is levy money that's being expended for a purpose. And we are responsible for levy money. So I just want to be real clear about this. The wage piece, that is a promise many people. Now, I will say that we've established a goals task force group that only met once. We had some really good conversation around the wage piece. I think that body will be helpful to help in the whole scheme of things. That body will be very helpful to help us mold our future around this wage piece. But many of us in the community, we believe in that wage piece. Now, who gets it, and who's a teacher, and who's not a teacher, you guys go work that out. But people in the community want $15. And how that gets there, or more. Or more. I keep hearing that, or more. And how we get there, we get there. I think that's important. Another thing that I didn't see I don't think I saw it on the agenda that we need to discuss is the qualifications for the new executive director. So I've been asked that personally, and then Cincinnati Promise Forward is gathering its own set of qualifications, personality traits, so that we can deliver that to the search head. I forget It's one of, it's our
Toyland.
people, Toyland, right, Toyland, I'm sorry, Toyland. So we can deliver that to Toyland, and I think this body needs to have some type of criteria if we're not gonna have that delivered to our folk that cover or that are representing us. I think those things are important for us to consider. Thank you.
Ms. Bolton.
Yes, I appreciate everyone's comments. We wanted the Preschool Promise Board to be independent. They are independent of us, and we are the source of the money. So that gives us a different level on the hierarchy of it, and this was a historic thing where we passed the public dollars were going to be used for, if you will, or by private people. I mean, that's what we did. That is very out there as we talk about proper public purpose. And to Ms. Bates's point, absolutely, we have to see the numbers as to whether or not the people that are receiving the grants for improvement are holding true to the original concept of this. This was not universal preschool.
That's right.
This was about addressing the needs of the most need-oriented folks we have, so that the children in these families could have a leg up, could have an opportunity to come into kindergarten better prepared. It was never about childcare. It was always about preschool, because those kids were operating at a disadvantage through no fault of their own or their families. And so I don't want us to lose focus on why we did that. This was not for childcare, and it was not universal preschool. It was to address an equity issue of little people. And that was to make sure they had the kind of education they're supposed to have in order to be competitive from day one, or at least a leg up for that. I'm so gratified by what Member Davis has said regarding our role in the money, because everybody wanted to do this. And City Council said no, Hamilton County Commission said no, the business community said no to an income tax. And the only taxing agent or entity that agreed to do it was us. And we agreed to share money that we raised by the very generosity of the taxpayers. We agreed to use some of that money for other people because we saw a larger community problem. So I don't want anybody to forget the role that CPS has played. I don't want anybody to forget that this was a groundswell bottom-up movement for the interest of children. But I really don't want people to forget that this was about the children and the families that needed the help the most, and that we couldn't do it alone.
Okay, so thank you for your comments. You know, I think I haven't given my thoughts, and I think they're perhaps a little bit different in that I think there's a separation of what is laid out today in the master agreement and maybe what we would like it to be going forward. And so I think that we have to root ourselves in specifically what does it say. And, you know, I think, you know, yes, I see an organizational chart of where money flows, and I think ensuring that there isn't or there aren't dollars being spent outside of what is allowable and what's within guidelines. Absolutely, I think, you know, we serve almost as an auditor because our treasurer is on the line there. Where I probably differ from some on the board is the day-to-day operations, I believe, is out of scope for me to weigh in on how they make decisions and how they run their organization, including who they select as the executive director, et cetera. Now, in the RACI diagram that you've heard me talk about, happy if they consult But I would also be just as happy as if they inform and say, here's what we're looking for based on our committee. And then, as it relates to how we operate with people we put in positions, I think it was what I wrote down is the philosophy of representation. I have a totally different philosophy because, I think as a citizen and from the outside looking at when City Hall appoints somebody to a commission and when you say, oh, well, that person's doing their bidding. I think it's one thing to make sure that they have information, but I think if you establish criteria and stakeholders that you want to represent you, when they're in the arena, using that analogy, if you know about that kind of parable, when they're in the arena and have access to information that maybe I don't, when they hear from somebody that I don't, when they, because they're spending their time solely focused there, I have to trust that they're going to make the best decision based on the fact that they came from a set of demographics that we thought would be good representation and would make a decision based on the information they had in their hands. Not to say, though, that we shouldn't somehow work to ensure that we have dialogue, so when they go in, they at least have that perspective from the board members. So, I think I was fortunate enough to be able to participate in some of the discussions with a couple of the board members that we appointed, a couple of other board members, and then President Jones, myself. I'm trying to think who else was on there. I know Vera was on the call, Laura, San Regret, and really worked to create the agenda. And the idea was this was not going to be a meeting where we could walk out with solutions to many of the things that Mr. Davis and others have brought out here, but that this would start to frame some working groups, perhaps, that would need to be formed by, maybe people sitting here, maybe people on their board, and other partners who would help us shape what the next iteration is for Preschool Promise. But I think it allows us to kind of live into that proverb: if you want to go quickly, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And then I'll add, if you want to go together and go far with some sanity, just align on governance and expectations. And I think a whole lot of the focus here is to just begin that process of aligning us to the same hymnal, so we're all singing the same tune, because I think that interpretations of the agreements, et cetera, allow us to have maybe a missed opportunity for alignment. Ms. Bull.
Most of what you said, I think we would agree with, but I've been told recently that the search committee, to your point about the executive director, the search committee has, I think, 5 total members, and 3 of them are our CPS representatives. I'm concerned about that because as we've been walking through this difficult path for some time, the fear or some of the negative thought is that, big bad CPS is throwing its weight around. I just think that we might want to ask, if that's what the Preschool Promise Board wants, that's what they want, but I think that we might be stepping into something that kind of communicates that we are indeed exercising more than our third of the representation, which is crucial for the 5, and the 5. It's different as it speaks to the money, because we're not only the auditor, we're the banker, and it's not going to go there if it's not going to go there. But I do think that politically might be a sensitive issue for us to have 3 of the 5, as well as have the honor of apparently the chair of the search committee is a CPS representative. So that, with other folks, that might look like and I don't think we had anything to do with it, but nobody will ever believe that.
Yeah, and my opinion is on that. I think, what we have to establish is what is the feedback mechanism? So, whoever gave you that information, I didn't know that. And my guess is 98 or 99.9% of Cincinnatians who voted for this will never know whoever was on that committee or who picked who was on the committee or otherwise. But we have to be cautious of optics and make sure that we control those things. And I don't even know if we have a process today. What is that process? How we could then give, say, hey, we'd like to just provide this input. Ultimately, you'll do what you want, but we want to make sure that we open the line so we get, those concerns into the hands of the people as they're making decisions. Because, probably in those cases, we've all been there. They're like, we didn't think about that. So, communication as well as that governance, and then really what I think is going to be creating a work plan of really what needs to happen between now and, the foreseeable future so that we can come together with a common understanding of the work ahead. Okay, so I will close that. I would look forward to that discussion on Wednesday. And Sally, we appreciate you being here tonight, and we'll see you then. Okay. And so we are going to do the first reading for board consideration regarding the district priorities for renegotiating the 1999 tax abatement agreement with the city of Cincinnati. Now, I will ask for your thoughts. I know all of you have received a copy of this, and probably like me, yours has some markings on it. Do you think we should read the whole thing or start to dig into some of the areas of opportunity? I'm seeing some digging motions. All right, so we'll dig in the interest of time. So you've all had a chance to read this. I'm going to open it up with one comment that I think that I was at a presentation last week by a guy who just started out with, just be kind. And so no calling out of anybody who put effort into this, but I think there's a way to soften things like broken promises and ways to make our point without grinding the axe. So tone, I think, is something that as we think through these comments, what is the right? Because I think going back to the other conversation, we don't want this to be here's how you should do your job, but I think we also want to call out things that are important to the stakeholders and constituents that we serve, as it's made very clear, we bear a huge part of the burden here. So, comments, Mr. Morosky.
That was an excellent way to set the stage, Vice President, Acting President Messer. A lot of my comments revolve around that. Softening it up in the third, I think the first whereas clause is fantastic. I'm just going to go through real quick. And so whoever needs to take notes, and disagree if you want to disagree, of course, obviously. In the second whereas, this will require more robust discussion, but to me it sounds like we are potentially asking again for the $5 million or not. I think we need to look at that number, and I'll just leave that there for now. The third whereas, I would excise the city as broken promises. Excuse me. If we want to talk about additions, perhaps that's the place to do it. Just for the board and the public's edification and knowledge, I'm more interested in things like school resource officers than I am crossing guards. The next whereas I think is excellent. And then now at the end, the resolves. Number 2, I'm curious what folks may think as y'all are giving your 2 cents about maybe being specific with saying 10 years or just says shorter than. If you want to leave it broad, I'm cool with that too. Just throw it out there. On the third, I already talked about residential earlier, and some confusion and sticking points that I personally have as one board member with that. And then the last 3, 4, 5, 6, the 7, I have no additions. 4, 5, and 6, to your point, Mr. Messer, about being, careful about how things are worded. This literally tells the city what they, quote, should do. And I don't like when people shit on me, and I try not to shit on other people. When they shit on me. Yeah. No one really likes to be shit on, and I certainly don't want to shit on the city in a year when we have a 10-year levy renewal on the ballot and maybe 2 levies next year.
And I will translate that was should.
For the record.
Yes.
I don't want to shit on the city. But I think this, asking for a transparency, public reconciliation process, I think that's really important, having an audit every single year. I don't care if it's calendar, fiscal, school, whatever, but like looking at this thing every year, which the current agreement says, it's just nobody's done it. And that, I think, is it as quickly as I can make it. My 2 cents.
Ms. Bates.
Well, after hearing Mr. Driehaus's presentation, I think that, we should take another look at whether we want an agreement at all. I mean, the assumption with this is that we want an agreement. Yes. And I heard something, in his presentation that gives me pause to consider the other option as the other 2 large cities have. So this was a good starting point. I was part of the group that put this together, but
see, you blame me. It was her.
I can hear her voice.
We had a quorum that day. Let's be clear about that. But I also want to kind of say, let's take a look at the options that the other cities are looking at. And as far as, if we do have an agreement, I know that Mr. Morosky said, what do you think? That we have current 20-year duration. If we have an agreement, we should look at it annually. And we should be working from the same data that the city is, so that if, a city official wants to pull up data on the agreement and the abatements, that they have the same data that we do. And right now, we're not sure if we have the correct data, if the city has the correct data, or the auditor. There's no provision for there is something about being reimbursed for that, but I think it's really important that we have that information centrally located that we can rely upon.
Mr. Davis.
I agree with Member Bates. As I stated at our last meeting, the option of not having an agreement needs to be in the resolution from a negotiation perspective. To be able to not have an agreement is a baseline for a negotiator. Additionally, this sounds a lot like we're talking to somebody else when we're supposed to be talking to ourselves. This is like our priorities. So even if we wanted to say that the city should do something, we have to reword it in some kind of way so that it's still our priority. But I can't tell you what to do. I can't make you make me a priority, if you get what I'm saying. And it seems like the way we are talking, it's to somebody else when these are supposed to be our priorities, setting the stage for how we want to negotiate going forward. But definitely somewhere in there has to be the opportunity to not have an agreement at all.
Thank you, Ms. Bolton.
I agree with you guys on others.
I'm still needing education from a standpoint of the value of not having an agreement. I need to investigate that more, or have other people more knowledgeable than I investigate it. and have it be presented, because even where there have not been where there's not been agreements, they've obviously arranged other sorts of mutually agreeable ways of operating, because they've said we want something about career paths, we want something about workforce development, some kind of an agreement or some kind of MOU or something has to exist in those cities where they may or may not have the kind of agreement that we're talking about. I think your point, Mr. Davis, about the voice of this is correct. I see it much more as to what our vision would be, what we would expect, representing our taxpayers and our children. This is what we expect to see in an agreement. So it would be more in our voice and as a vision and as an expectation. I do think that, as I said the other week, we do have to include some in-kind services. Priority one being resource officers have to be part of this agreement. We cannot face the possibility that we do not have Cincinnati's police force available to us, and they're under that other jurisdiction and what have you, and that we cannot pay for that. I do think that we should build some sort of time framework, and maybe it's 10, but we have to live by a 5-year plan. And the city has a biennial budget, as does the state. So those things that are already part of process or practice, I see that as being a way to make sense so that you're not creating yet another time to look at something. I think that's it. Philosophically, we as a board have not decided whether or not we want to have all the authority that not having an agreement might mean. I mean, that we have not decided that. So that has to be part of our dialogue. I would also say that I think it would make sense for some mutual commitment to shared services, because I think the public would expect that. And we do already in some areas do that, but I think at least a kind of uplifting view of that. The last time we tried to write a resolution and it impacted the city, it was about preschool. They wrote a resolution, we wrote a resolution, and then nobody did anything about it. As a matter of fact, I think it was vetoed or something, because it only had 5 supporters instead of 6. So I do think that there's an interest in the community about preschool, and there's a tremendous interest both by the city and the business folks and everybody else about workforce development. So I think there's a couple of areas where we could say that we want a partnership. I think some of the stuff that was mentioned today by Mr. Driehaus, if the superintendent's team looks at that and the treasurer's team looks at that, if some of that is attractive or would make sense to us, we ought to incorporate it. And there has to be a part in this where we describe how we expect this abatement process to be. The transparency piece, the open discussion, a true review committee. I mean, maybe we can't change their review committee, and we better check who our seat is on that. But the review committee, maybe we have a review committee. So I think there's ways to work on this, and obviously we don't have to do it. Administration has to try to capture some of this, but I think in kind, better language of first-person voice, a vision, expectation, shared services, resource officers, and I hate to say it, but I would love to see an expectation that they will, over the next several years or 3 years, actually provide safety mechanisms where they have jurisdiction, because we can't put the safety signs out. And they've only done what state law requires them to do at our high schools. I think there's a commitment to create another district-wide safe routes to school. There's certain things that we could commit to together if people were interested in a partnership.
Thank you. Ms. Bates.
There was a point that was made in that meeting that really didn't make it in this draft, and it received strong agreement from the quorum, as I recall, and that another priority of this district is to ensure the growth of this district. And when when our families are being pushed out to outside of the district because of lack of affordable housing, we're not growing our district. As a matter of fact, the city's not growing. We're growing because we are getting children back from charter schools, and because we have a pretty large refugee and immigrant population. So as part of the agreement, what did he call it? The trinkets and treasures, that we should also mention that we want to ensure that there's affordable housing built into some of the developments that are getting these large abatements. So we're not pushing out our families to get new families. This city right now, has a population of about 300,000. At one time, we had 500,000. There's certainly room in this city for more people, a whole heck of a lot more people than we have right now. And there's not an opportunity for them to remain in many cases. So I think that it's important and ethically for us to include that, and equitably as well, to make sure that that's covered in the negotiating agreement, or in the negotiations for the agreement.
Thank you. And I echo a lot of the comments that have been shared. The voice I have in my head is that really what our comments are is representing the stakeholders to which we are responsible, including taxpayers, the families, and the children. And I think having it from that voice and, calling out, and I was going to dig in and find my list from the last meeting, but, affordable housing was on my list. There are some very specific things. And, I think using that accountability to the stakeholders that we're responsible for as the voice, so it has nothing to do with what you need to do, but this is what we believe a successful agreement would look like, and we lay out the criteria, then I think, then you tell us what you think. And I would bet, actually, knowing so many down at City Hall, like the people on my left and right, there's probably a whole lot that'll look at that and say, guess what? Me too. And I think definitely I wrote in on this as Mr. Driehaus was going through. There are a couple of points that we could put in there. The trinkets and treasures, I hesitate with that labeling, but what it shows is a contribution showing that where you have successful cities, you have successful schools, and where you have successful schools, you have successful cities, and tying that together. This is an and conversation. So if we approach it from that lens and look at those creative ways that were very clearly stated here, my question is, how do we package what we saw here and get it into the hands of some of those others? Because I think it will absolutely shape, having watched the budget committee, it'll shape their thought process, because I think they were given a very narrow scope. Here's a few things we can tweak and twist, and maybe the data wasn't 100% accurate on the few things that were presented there. So I think we'll hold till assignments on kind of next steps with this, but I think I've got a page of notes here from what I've heard of some enhancements, and maybe we can cross-check and make sure that we've caught all of those. Mr. Morosky.
Do we have any sense of timeline regarding when we would need to have this approved?
I think that the goal was to do this is first reading, make some edits, and try to have our resolution ready before our the last meeting we have in June, and that way we can make that public. It may also then give an opportunity for council before they break to see if they would like to put something together that would be a complement. And if that were the case, perhaps that puts two nice guardrails that allows for a much smoother process for those that are actually in the weeds working on the agreement. Ms. Bolton?
To that point, I think we had said the 19th and the 24th. We would see this again on the 19th and then hopefully be able to pass it on the 24th. I think by, again, doing everything that we're doing publicly as a body is extremely important, because I'm not sure that's necessarily how the city functions. Seems to be much more organized around the administration taking particular charge. So I think if one elected body, and then we have our colleagues in the city council, they see that we're doing this, that to your point, they too can think about what is best for them and what they value. I think that'd be perfect.
Very good. Okay. So I don't believe we have to do any votes on an initial reading, but we will have some edits certainly that we will bring back on our June 19th meeting. Okay, so Mr. Davis, we're gonna be in the speed round here. Everybody buckle up. We're gonna rock and roll through these resolutions. So we'll allow you to start out with your first one.
I present a resolution amending Board Policy 5751, parental married status of students. I present the resolution as printed for adoption.
Do I have a motion?
I'll make the motion.
Oh, good. And then I have a second. Ms. Bowers. Perfect. Ms. Wagner, please call the roll.
You usually ask for discussion first.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Any discussion or comments? I was going too fast. All right, Ms. Wagner, please call the roll.
Mrs. Bates.
Aye.
Ms. Bolton.
Aye.
Mrs. Bowers.
Aye.
Mr. Davis.
Aye.
Mr. Messer.
Aye.
Mr. Morosky.
All right. Ms. Bates, please present the resolution for board consideration.
Yes, I have a resolution amending Board Policy 6835, Audit Committee. I present this resolution as printed for adoption.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion or comments? Ms. Wagner, please call the roll.
Mrs. Bates.
Aye.
Ms. Bolton.
Aye.
Mrs. Bowers.
Aye.
Mr. Davis.
Aye.
Mr. Messer.
Aye.
Mr. Morosky.
Ms. Bowers, you're up.
I have a resolution amending Board Policy 7510, use of district facilities and property. I present this resolution for adoption as written.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Any comments or discussion? Ms. Wagner, please call the roll.
Mrs. Bates.
Aye.
Ms. Bolton.
Aye.
Mrs. Bowers.
Aye.
Mr. Davis.
Aye.
Mr. Messer.
Aye.
Mr. Morosky.
All right. Ms. Bates, you're up again.
I'm trying. Do we have a copy of that so I can see what I thought we did that with the Audit Committee. I don't know why that's here a second time.
Is it the charter versus the policy?
Okay, yes, that's correct. I have the, okay, I do have it. I have a resolution amending the Audit Committee Charter. So I present this resolution as printed for adoption.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Comments, discussion? None heard. Ms. Wagner, please call the roll.
Mrs. Bates.
Aye.
Ms. Bolton.
Aye.
Mrs. Bowers.
Aye.
Mr. Davis.
Aye.
Mr. Messer. Aye. Mr. Morosky.
All right. Ms. Bolton, you're up.
Would this be the resolution determining to proceed with submission of a renewal tax levy?
Correct as usual.
I will then submit and hope for approval, resolution determining to proceed with submission of a renewal tax levy.
And do I have a second?
Second.
Comments, discussion?
Perhaps the treasurer just would tell us the process again, why we have to do this.
Yes, so the first resolution was a resolution announcing the need for the levy. This resolution has been certified by the county auditor on the millage and the language, and that once you approve it, we sign it. Legal counsel and I will drive it up to the Hamilton County Board of Elections, and they will issue us an issue number when sometime in August or September.
If I might, so is the language that we see here the language that would appear on the ballot?
That's correct.
Thank you.
Very good. Ms. Wagner, please call the roll.
Mrs. Bates? Aye. Ms. Bolton?
Aye.
Mrs. Bowers?
Aye.
Mr. Davis?
Aye.
Mr. Messer?
Aye.
Mr. Morosky?
Aye.
Okay, moving on to our superintendent, Mitchell.
Way to wake everyone up. All right, so I do have a very short report. You know, I always like to highlight our students. So as you can see, we have our wonderful, beautiful young people representing those who are enrolling in school, enlist in the military, and employed.
Yes.
And I believe that the DHL young man was in a commercial for DHL. It was wonderful. Yes. Yeah. So you might be interested to know that Wanna Hill student, yes, it was great, competes in a national spelling bee. The, oh, did I go one too far? Okay. This is a picture of 3 young men or more men who earn the Man of the Year award. These are our lovely little Evanston children. They participated in a career option day and college Friday. And I think that's it. I had one other picture that's in my packet, but it didn't make it on the screen. And that's our young man. I believe that you saw the video of the young man who was rapping. He actually won a national contest. He is from Covedale School. So
Wonderful.
That concludes my report.
All right. Do I have a motion to approve the revised recommendations of the superintendent?
So moved.
Any discussion or comments? Okay, Ms. Wagner, please call the roll.
Mrs. Bates?
Aye.
Ms. Bolton?
Aye.
Mrs. Bowers? Aye. Mr. Davis?
Aye.
Mr. Messer?
Aye.
Mr. Morosky?
Yes.
Okay. Do I have a motion to approve the revised report of our treasurer?
So moved.
Is there a second? And discussion. Ms. Wagner, please call the roll.
Mrs. Bates?
Aye.
Ms. Bolton?
Aye.
Mrs. Bowers?
Aye.
Mr. Davis?
Aye.
Mr. Messer?
Aye.
Mr. Morosky?
Okay, any inquiries or updates? Seeing none? Keeping us moving. Let's shift to assignments. Ms. Bolton.
Well, I'd like to assign to the administration, as was mentioned earlier, to review the presentation by Mr. Driehaus and see if there are any particular items or thoughts or packages that would make sense for us to add and come back, if you would, and maybe build some of those that you might think would be valuable into the next resolution that we might be seeing on the 19th.
If I could add to that, I think, you know, also working with him, and I think this might be a fairly easy lift, but to just create a grid with the buckets and what's included kind of by the benchmarking. So this city had these items, this city, and so you could look at, you know, how they dealt with TIFs. Were they directed or were they wide open? Did they hold us harmless or did they not? And I think that alone will be eye-opening, to be the only city, in, just looking at the TIFs, where it was, you know, very clear that we were not only not held harmless, but we in this city had more TIFs than others across the state. So I think just having kind of the summary of that presentation in grid form by category would be a great help. Anything else under assignments? Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, it has been a true pleasure this evening, and I appreciate the opportunity to facilitate. Ladies and gentlemen, I declare this meeting adjourned.
Let the church say